Good morning and welcome to the VSTMA Sports Field Management webinar series, Relevant Topics for Uncertain Times. My name is Chris Webb. I'm the Vice President of the VSTMA and I'll be today's moderator. Today's topic will be plant growth regulator use, and our presenter today will be Dr. Shawn Askew. Dr. Askew is a professor and extension specialist in turfgrass weed science at Virginia Tech. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Askew. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Glad to be with everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here in just a second, but I would encourage everyone to ask questions. This is kind of it's a broad topic, plant growth regulators, and arguably the research that's been done historically on plant growth regulators does not really apply very well to athletic field management, in my opinion, and it's been my opinion for quite some time. We haven't had enough research done in athletic situations when it comes to plant growth. In fact, any other situation outside of golf, and in particular golf putting greens. So fielding questions even related to golf fairways can be somewhat challenging depending on the scenario, because the amount of actual research that's been done in some of those areas is much less than that of putting greens. But what I've done is I've put together some slides that I'm going to go over a little bit of basics to kind of give you to kind of set the scene, and then I've got some slides that are more in tune to long-term turf suppression because of the COVID situations that everyone's dealing with. But again, let me come full circle on this. Please ask questions, because that's the only way you're going to get what you would like to get out of this webinar, because the topic is broad and can go in a number of different directions. I deleted 119 slides from my plant growth regulator presentation, because I just don't think it applies to you guys. But if you're interested in poa-annua seed head suppression and things like that, that's fine, because I think there's a place for that in athletic fields using plant growth regulators. Starting out with just some basics, I'm gonna blow through this, but I kind of need to set the stage, because so we know pretty much what plant growth regulators are. There's been different classifications made for those. But essentially it's anything that is intended to change the growth pattern of the plant. And that can be up promoted or down promoted. We normally think of these things as plant growth reducers, but they can also be enhancers in the case of the biostimulants and things. Dr. Irvin has done quite a bit of, former professor from Virginia Tech, now at Delaware. He's done quite a bit of work in this area. Actually, he proposed one of the most recent classification systems. And what we're going to talk about, if you look at Class D, this is an arena that typically is not utilized in ornamental turf grass. Typically, if you're going to use a Class D PGR, such as herbicides, that's going to be done on the roadside or in industrial sites. And so, but there is some application, as long as you're willing to take an aesthetic hit, or as long as you're willing to do something like paint, chelated iron, etc., to manage an aesthetic reduction, you can get long-term growth retardation from products like that, and I'll hit on that today. Okay, so when we look at products that you would be more familiar with, like Primo, and you think about what they're designed to do, they are not designed to manage a COVID-19 situation where all your employees are at home and you can't get around to get all the grass mowed in a timely manner. They'll help with that. They definitely will help. They'll help with managing clipping, production, etc. So you can go out with higher rates of things like Primo, and that's definitely going to help with clipping reduction. But what these things are really designed to do is to improve aesthetics and to offer stress tolerance and things like that. So they help you on the day-to-day management of clippings, but they're more in tune to managing density and color in turf, because they reduce your vertical growth, which reduces the amount of material being mowed off, but it also compacts the amount of area, so it limits the amount of area that chlorophyll has to exist in, and therefore you get a darker green color per unit area because there's less unit area with the same amount of chlorophyll. The amount of chlorophyll each cell is going to have is predetermined at cell birth. And so if that cell does not elongate, if it's shorter, things are darker green because the chlorophyll is packed in, as you can see in the images there. And so this stunting, you know, it's not growth inhibition. So we don't really get long-term growth cessation or inhibition from PGRs. Instead, we get this short-term stunting. And, you know, PGRs can have, and I feel like the literature is a bit misleading in this area, but PGRs can have an effect on aesthetics. If you look at the images here, you can see some greenhouse work where products like Proxy, Cutlass, and in this case, Turf Enhancer is going to be the same thing as Trimit, it's paclobutazole. And those three arguably are the most aggressive in terms of discoloring our desirable turf. But typically, you see this severe type discoloration on the first application. And once you are repeatedly applying the product, a couple of things happen. This type of injury response pretty much goes away, and the level and duration of suppression you can get with subsequent application goes down a little bit as well. And what you're trying to do normally is keep applying PGRs on a routine frequency so that you reduce the growth rate by about 50% is what we're looking for. But there are other uses for PGRs other than just enhancing aesthetics and enhancing density, and I think that's what we really want to hit on today. I'm expecting that's what most of the questions are going to be related to. And so, for example, when you don't have a crew to come in and weed eat fence rows and whatnot, you need some type of method to deal with that. And so there are a couple of ways short of killing that grass to limit its growth. And in fact, killing the grass would be detrimental because what that's going to do is it'll open up an avenue for unwanted weeds that actually grow faster than the grass to come into that area. So if you can't weed eat this, what do? Well, ideally, and as with any PGR, you're going to initially cut the grass to whatever your desired aesthetic is going to be. And at that point, you're going to apply the PGR. So that goes, in a case of this fence row, you definitely would want to come in and weed eat initially before you apply the PGR. This image is probably from a scenario where the turf outside has been continuously mowed. And what we're showing here is probably after a month or so, reduced regrowth of a PGR treated fence row. But if this is what our fence row looked like initially and we're getting ready to spray, what we would want to do is weed eat initially and then spray a PGR. And if you look on a Primo label, there's going to be rates for, you know, the fence row type suppression. It's going to be higher than the traditional use rates. Other products that you could use in this scenario would be metsulfuron or glyphosate, both of which are going to be effective. I'll also talk a little bit about Ornamec or Fusilade, which again, legally, when you start talking about using Fusilade as a PGR, there really is no category in the label of that product for that. But certainly, if you used Fusilade, for example, on this fence row, if it's tall fescue situation, if you use Fusilade on that fence row for the purpose of Bermuda grass control or paspalum control, then you would be completely legal. And the fact that you got a desirable PGR effect from that is of no consequence. But Fusilade, excuse me, at the or Ornamec, at the rate suggested on the label for Bermuda grass control, is an outstanding tall fescue plant growth regulator. And I'll show you some images here in a little bit, but it'll shut that fence row turf down for a period of about 5 weeks with minimal discoloration. You'll just get stunting. Maybe we can sometimes see up to 10% thinning, but not an issue. You know, we use it out in the open on ornamental turf routinely. But the label does restrict the number of weed species that you can target in tall fescue because of injury concerns. So they're really going after nasty weeds like paspalum and Bermuda grass. But it's an outstanding plant growth regulator for a situation like this. Metsulfuron at 1/4 to 1/2 ounce per acre is going to give you more yellow discoloration than Ornomec would. And glyphosate at 3 ounces, 3 to 5 ounces per acre would likewise give you more discoloration than Fusilade. If you want the best aesthetic possible, you would go with a higher rate of Primo. Now, before I leave this slide, this kind of opens up a different topic of conversation. What are you going to spray this with? Right? It's going to be a pump spray or a backpack. And here I am talking about 3 ounces product per acre. So really to do this, or to do it well, we have to walk away from our, put the product in at 1% by solution and just spray to wet. That's not going to work. We're going to have to use a pump sprayer, and we're going to have to deliver pretty close to a targeted rate per acre, and a targeted application volume is the only way that we can ensure that we've delivered that targeted rate. And so that requires a few additional techniques and some calibration and practice before, you can achieve this. And so, I mean, one of the easiest ways to do that would be to get your backpack, get it mixed up with regular water, get on dry pavement, and dial in if you have an adjustable nozzle, dial that in to give you the width of spray that you want. And then practice kind of walking the pavement to look at the width of the pattern that you're delivering, and dial in your walking speed. And then you can use that backpack just like any other sprayer. You're going to kind of use the same frequency of pumping to deliver roughly the same pressure, either that or put a pressure regulator behind the nozzle, and then catch your output per 30 seconds or so and determine what your output per unit time is. And as you're walking fence rows and spraying with a backpack, ideally what you're going to do is just set that pattern and just walk a continuous speed, whether it's 2 miles an hour, 3 miles an hour, or if you're a pretty speedy person and you're walking 4 miles an hour, you need to know what you're walking and what your output per unit time is, and you can back calculate your application volume from a backpack in a scenario like this. And once that's done, then you can dial in your 3 ounces per acre of Roundup or your 1/2 ounce per acre of Metsulfuron, both of which would be the most economical methods of achieving long-term suppression, but a little more discoloration. Then you up the ante a little bit on economics when you move to something like Fusilade or Ornomec, and then something like Primo is going to be in range with Ornomec, or possibly some of the PGRs can be quite expensive, north of $100 per acre. Primo is not going to be quite that expensive. It's going to be similar to something like Ornomec. All right, so what about a situation like this? If you, now this is a, COVID-19 aside and lack of labor and all of that, this is a scenario where even if you had all the labor that you could pay for on hand, you probably wouldn't want those people on the side of this bank if you could avoid it. I mean, you would need rappelling gear to treat this. And there are scenarios in some of our parks that, there's embankments that maybe a riding mower shouldn't be on. And so the ability to limit the frequency that we have to mow those areas would be a positive. And so just like the fence row scenario, one of those Class D PGRs, like a herbicide at low rates, could be a solution. And in all of these scenarios, I don't know if I've mention it, I don't guess I did, but fence row, or if you're out in the open ornamental turf, and like now that we're dealing with COVID and you don't have labor, we could be talking some of your large open areas that aren't necessarily, I don't know about in play right now, but the actual athletic fields, some of the lower value turf, you can use these same techniques on and get 5 to 6 week suppression. And if the discoloration that's coming with these type treatments is an issue, then paint is an option. And so if you have, for example, if you were to use extremely high rates of plant growth regulator, which is going to cost you at or north of $100 per acre, you can instead put that money into a few dollars per acre of Roundup plus paint. So using a colorant such as a turf paint in conjunction with these herbicide-based PGRs can be a way to maintain aesthetic while essentially eliminating mowing for 5 or 6 weeks. The downside is now your turf is severely regulated, and if for some reason you had damage or you had a need to have wear, you're kind of locked out for 5 or 6 weeks. And another thing that I'll mention, and you can take this to the bank, you write this down. Unfortunately, we can't, after the turf starts releasing about 6 weeks out, between 6 and 9 weeks, the turf is going to transition back to normal. The normal desire, if you needed another 6 weeks of suppression, would be to go out and reapply the same, let's say the glyphosate scenario, 3 ounces of glyphosate per acre. Don't do that. Unfortunately, when we come out with a repeat application of these Class D PGRs, oftentimes we get catastrophic loss of turf, 40, 50% stand loss. And so the turf can sustain this type of growth inhibition for a pretty long period of time, but it's not, sustainable forever. And so if you continue to hit the tall fescue with herbicide-based PGRs, turf thinning will occur. And in industrial situations, no big deal. But in an ornamental turf situation, that's going to persist. It'll take most of the fall for you to recover from that scenario. All right, so on my Zoom, I don't really, if there are any questions, I can't see them. So Whitney.
Shawn, I'll chime in if we get any questions.
All right, great. All right, so I'm going to move on. But by all means, if anyone has a question, please type that out and we'll cover it. All right, so back to benefits of PGRs. When you look at, and this is late season on Bermuda grass, and this is a very common scenario where we start getting this rapid growth of the Bermuda grass due to changes in light quantity and quality late in the season, and due to the fact that the Bermuda grass has run out of space. Well, it starts growing over the top of itself, and you start getting scalping, and PGRs can really help with that scenario. Here's an example. So in the center of the image, the area was treated with Primo, and that has prevented the scalping that you see on either edge of those plots. And so that's, again, improving aesthetics by improving density, color, etc. is the normal use for plant growth regulators. That, and then you have pole annual suppression and seed head suppression. That's where most of the money is spent in the industry. Here's another example of improving aesthetics. Cutlass shown over here on the right on a Bermuda grass fairway versus Primo. This was discovered about a decade ago, and since then there's been kind of the standard program for Bermuda grass situations is going to be some combination of fliprimidol with things like Primo or maybe a little bit of Trimit. There's some combo products that are available on the market as well for that. And then, as I mentioned, annual bluegrass seed head suppression is a big deal. I mean, this is showing putting green, but in my opinion, we need more research on athletic fields, because there's only two scenarios in my mind where the cost associated with seed head suppression, which is going to be about, for a typical scenario on a putting green, you're looking at 3 applications for the year, 1 in the fall and 2 in the spring, and they're going to cost about $100 to $110 each. Well, if you do the math real quick, you'll see that on large open areas like athletic fields, I mean, you could pay for products that would actually control the POA annua at those prices. But in high wear athletics, we really do not have the ability to sustain the injury from the herbicides that would go after that POA annua. On putting greens, we also do not have the ability to take the injury that would be associated with POA annua control products. So those two scenarios in the industry, in my opinion, are the best fits for seed head suppression. Because with seed head suppressing products, well, which we're pretty much limited to Ethifon at this point, with Ethifon, you're not really looking at turf injury. It's just costly. You know, it's going to cost you $300+ per acre per year in order to manage POA seed heads. And those are rates for greens, which are arguably, if I had to put a number to it, I would say at least 30% easier to control POA annua seed heads than higher heights of cut like athletic fields. And so the solution would not be a 30% higher rate, but rather 30% more applications. We've been doing some research recently on mixing POA annua control herbicides like ethifumicate at low rates to augment seed head suppression from Ethifon, and they're doing really well at an economical cost. So I can take Progress at 1/4 of the rate, and either alone or mixed with a standard Ethifon program, I can get excellent seed head suppression. The problem that I'm a bit concerned about is Progress or ethifumicate is already a herbicide that's been characterized by increased chances of developing herbicide-resistant POA. And one of the best ways to develop resistance in a weed is to spray a herbicide at a sublethal rate. And so by using Ethifon to achieve seed head suppression by injuring the POA rather than killing the plants, what we're doing is we're taking out all of the plants that are susceptible at that 1/4x rate. And we're leaving behind all of the plants that are more tolerant of that 1/4x rate. So next year, you know, we have all of the plants in that population are a little bit more tolerant to ethifumicate than last year. And you keep doing this over and over, and you pretty much weed out of the population all plants that are highly susceptible. So you're getting rid of the highly susceptible to ethifumicate genes from the pollen flow. And over time, that can make the entire population more resistant to ethifumicate, such that you no longer have that herbicide to kill POA in the future. So that would be a big negative to an approach using low-rate PGRs specifically targeted at the reproductive stage of POA annua. But anyway, so I'm almost to our long-term suppression work that we've done recently. And again, I guess I'm beating a dead horse here, but this is just a graphical representation of what we're trying to achieve with products like Primo. And again, it's not really that long-term suppression that you might need right now dealing with lack of labor, etc. What we're trying to do is get a smoother suppression pattern, so that and typically people who are on a PGR program in ornamental turf grass, they're mowing at the same frequency they did prior to starting the PGR program. It's just that the mowing is easier, there's less clippings, and the turf looks better. Not to say that you can't use products like Primo to extend mowing frequency, because you can. It takes higher rates, and you get your overall quality is not going to be necessarily where you want, because you're going to have patches of turf that start to break earlier than others. And so you're going to have to put up with a kind of an unkept looking condition for the latter part of your extended period. Like if you normally would mow weekly and you decide to mow every 2 weeks, from the 1 week mark to the 2 week mark, it's kind of going to look like you haven't mowed for over a week. It'll look almost the same as it would if you had not used the PGR, because there's going to be rogue plants out there coming through. But at that 2 week mark, when you go to mow, the turf will be thin enough that the mower can plow right through it, no problem. It will not be the massive amount of clippings, nor will you be dealing with harming the turf as much as you would by cutting down into the stem material. And so that's kind of the advantage it's going to give you. And for those of you that really need to manage your aesthetics, that's probably going to be the approach you should take. It's going to be with frequent use of products like Primo, where normally you would not have used them to help you manage the infrequency of mowing. All right, so there's also, we really don't need to get into this, but what this is looking at is potential stress mitigating benefits of plant growth regulators, such as, if you're taking away energy that's lost due to mowing in the foliage, it's been shown that plants can then utilize that energy to make deeper roots. They tend to get tolerance to shade, for example. Here's an example with only 25% of available light being given to the plant over a period of time with no Primo. And here it is with 1/8 of an ounce Primo. And there it is with a 1/4 ounce Primo. And then, of course, poannual suppression, as I've already mentioned, is another use.
Dr. Askew, we've had a question come in. Are there any granular PGR options, or is it all foliar applied?
Wow, that's a good question. It is possible. You would think I would know, but I have not worked with any granular plant growth regulators. So if they have been marketed, I am not aware. If anybody is on that is aware and that could comment on that, please do so. But I am not aware currently of a granular plant growth regulator.
I know there's a granular cutlass, but I've never used it in Bermuda. We've used it on hedges on campus.
Okay.
That's the only one I'm aware of.
That would make sense because but with both cutlass and Trimmet, there's an appreciable root uptake involved with those products. And I would imagine the formulations chemistry is going to be right up their alley with florprimidol, because unlike the other products, it's always been you've had to mix this dry dispersible granule in water rather than having a liquid that would be easier to measure and mix. And I would imagine that's because the product is quite difficult to formulate into a liquid. And so, lending it easier for a granular formulation. Any other questions? All right, let me share with you some recent, well, some of it's not recent, but some work that's been done on long-term suppression of fescue, so you kind of see what you're dealing with some of these products. So the major players for Class D plant growth regulators would be these three. It's going to be glyphosate, metsulfuron, or fluazepam. and I've got rates given there for the glyphosate. So glyphosate, if you're dealing with a 4-pound active ingredient per acre product, such as Roundup Pro, not Roundup Pro concentrate, okay? So Roundup Pro would be a 4-pound AI, which is 3-pound acid equivalency, AE, per gallon. And that product would go out at 3 to 5 ounces per acre as a plant growth regulator on tall fescue turf. If you had the 5-pound active ingredient, and it's about 4.2 or so acid equivalency, Roundup Pro concentrate or equivalent products, that the rates are going to be slightly lower for that. You can do the math on that. Metsulfuron, and so that rate of glyphosate, you're looking at, it's probably something like 35 to 50 cents an acre. So chemical cost is not a problem. What you're managing with that product is injury cost, okay? And you definitely don't want to go over budget, all right? So your rate has to be tack on, and environmental conditions can really influence how much absorption you get on one day versus another. And so these things can be, at those rates though, the risk that you're taking, you're going to swing from very little discoloration, but unfortunately only a couple of weeks of growth retardation, to a 6 to 7, well, actually, I guess on the extreme end, to more of a 9-week growth suppression with 30% loss of turf. That's kind of the world you'd be living in. And but it would be very rare to be on either of those extremes, where you're typically going to find yourself. I mean, you have a 95% chance of finding yourself in a scenario of 4 to 6 weeks of growth suppression with essentially no turf loss, up to maybe 10%, but you have, it's going to be 50 to 70% yellow to necrotic leaf blades for the bulk of that time. It's going to, basically, it makes your turf look like an extremely droughty turf. So when drought kicks in and we're 2.5 weeks with no rain, midsummer, it's hot, and turf just shuts down, I've always thought it was amazing how people just, they just accept that. It's no problem. It's Mother Nature. When the rain comes back, it's going to pop back. Well, the same thing happened with this glyphosate program, but usually there's, for some reason, a different take on herbicide injury. If a herbicide does exactly what that drought did, it's the end of the world. I have often observed. Same thing with frost. If I go out during Bermuda grass green up and cause 15% injury, I can have a turf manager biting nails over that. But then I've gone to the same facility and the same turf manager 2 weeks later, because of a late frost, we get 90% brownout of that, what was 90% green turf a week ago. And the guy just shrugs his shoulders and says, it'll recover. And I'm like, whoa, back up. You went nuts over this 15% injury a couple weeks ago. So anyway, these things are not unrelated. Drought injury, frost injury, they're kind of similar from a physiological standpoint to that herbicide injury. And the recovery patterns are going to be fairly similar as well. And the problem with the herbicide is you don't want to overstep the dose such that you get more impact than you had hoped. I mentioned glyphosate is 35 to 50 cents an acre. Metsulfuron at a 1/4 ounce per acre is going to weigh in economically in a similar fashion. You can buy nowadays like 2 ounces of metsulfuron for $20, maybe 30 at the most. And so, you're looking at a 1/4 ounce rate costing on the order of $4 to, about $4 an acre. So very affordable from a chemical cost standpoint. Again, what you're trying to manage though is not getting turf loss. And then looking at fluazepop, we would be looking there at a cost more along the lines of probably $80, $90 per acre, which is going to be similar to a high rate, maybe a little bit higher than a high rate Primo program. Let's look at what some of these things will do to the turf. All right, so this is glyphosate at 5 ounces to the acre of an isopropylamine salt that's a 4-pound active ingredient per gallon. And what you're looking at is, if you look just behind the orange line in the front there, the first 4 feet behind that, which is in front of the irrigation pipe, running left to right, is a strip that was treated with glyphosate 7 days prior to the image being taken. All right, this next image, the plot is rotated. The image was taken at a 90-degree different angle, so it's a little bit easier to see what's happening. So at, this image. At 18 days after treatment, you can see exactly where the treated area is. And so again, here we're dealing with 50% discoloration in the form of necrotic leaf blades, yellow leaf blades, etc. And at 23 days after treatment, again, most of that turf is shut down. Now, unfortunately, we're continuing to mow the surrounding turf, so you really can't see, but we're talking, you know, we're almost a month in here, and obviously there's absolutely no growth. And so with a colorant, that could look awesome. I mean, but if you're getting wear on this situation, you know, that would not be good. Any additional stress that turf is going to receive is not going to be beneficial. But it will shut it down for 6 to 8 weeks. You'll start after about a month. You can already see it happening in the center of this plot. You'll start to get a few plants to escape, and those are going to turn into longer and longer leaf blades. And by usually 6 or 7 weeks, you're going to have the appearance of a field that needs to be mowed. It probably still is not at a density that would, you know, you can probably still wait another week or so before it starts to get to a situation where it's going to be difficult to mow. But it definitely, and again, you can get away with this once per season. So if you've got areas that are not as visible that you want to implement this anytime, it can work. If they have to be, if it has to look really good through this regulated period, then you're going to need to use a colorant. And then the cost associated with that goes, you know, back in line with what you would have spent on labor to mow it. So that's typically going to be more associated with areas that, if you have to use the colorant, that's going to be associated with areas that are difficult to mow, for example, or with limited areas that cost more to mow, like fence rows. Because then you can, you know, it's a very small acreage with high labor input to mow to weed eat a fence row. So the use of something like the Roundup 3 to 5 ounce plus green longer paint is going to be a pretty good deal there, as long as you can manage the application of the paint to not discolor your fence. Here's another trial. In this case, you see a bunch of yellow spots everywhere. This is actually a trial where we're looking at long-term Class D PGRs to suppress tall fescue growth in the spring in order to release bulb flowering plants in a kind of a bulb meadow scenario. So first couple of months of spring leading up to early summer, you get this nice floral display out of your turf. And then when summer conditions hit, the bulbs melt away. They've been chosen to be early season bloomers, and the turf then flourishes. But what we want to do is during that period of bulb production, early spring through early summer, we want to suppress turf growth so it's not competing with the bulbs and they can store as much carbohydrate as possible. So what we're looking at here is 10 days after treatment of several different plant growth regulators. And just looking, so, right, can you guys see my mouse moving? Somebody
Yes.
Yes. Good. Okay. All right. So my mouse right now is situated in the lower left-hand corner of the image, and that is our first plot. This is an untreated check. You see that it's darker green. All right. The very next plot over, it's metsulfuron at 0.1 ounces. So that's 0.1 ounces of metsulfuron. This is only 10 days after treatment, though. This is Primo at 33 ounces to the acre, right here, the third plot over. The fourth plot over is glyphosate at 2 ounces per acre, right there, at 10 days out. And here's Ornament, already effectively, discoloring the turf slightly. But Ornament we went with 24 ounces per acre of Ornament. That's a ½ pound per gallon product. And that's this one here. So let's move forward to 15 days after application. And here's our untreated check. Here's our metsulfuron treatment. This is Primo right here. And Roundup. And there's Ornament. So you're looking at this and you're thinking, whoa, I'm getting more discoloration from the Ornament. Maybe I'd choose one of these other products. The problem is, you'll notice all of those rates that I mentioned are a bit lower than the kind of industrial PGR rates that I've mentioned throughout this presentation. Like metsulfuron, normally I would be at a 1/4 ounce. We're at 0.1. We were trying to err on the safety side for the flowers because we've done some greenhouse work that looked at that. The glyphosate, normally I would be at 3 to 5. We're at 2. All right. And so, but the Ornament, which was the absolute safest on the flowers, we went with full load of 24 ounces. And I'll show you what that looks at ground level in a moment, just prior to a 4-week mowing. Here it is at 36 days out. And again, the Ornament, we've got some necrosis in there. The overall quality of the turf is depleted a little bit. But not severely, and certainly looking straight overhead with the drone, it looks a little worse actually than it does on the ground. Here it is from a ground view. This is 4 weeks out, and this is the Ornament. This is what you want. From a distance, driving by a park facility, that's not going to look that bad. And the other products are going to need, let's see, backing up here. This is glyphosate here. And the next one behind it is the Primo. And the next one behind that, you're getting a little regulation there. That's metsulfuron. And then the non-treated check. And so Primo and glyphosate do look a little better in terms of, and you can look out here as well, in terms of the overall number of seed heads and the overall height of the turf and density of the turf. It is somewhat diminished, but not as well as the metsulfuron or the Ornament. We can go probably another couple of weeks and get 6 weeks out of that Ornament. And that's very typical for all the reason I know about Ornament working this well for this purpose is because of all of the work that we've done on Bermuda grass control in tall fescue versus paspalum control in tall fescue, and looking at that pattern that the fescue will give us coming out of the spring and into the early summer season. All right, so that's my slides. We're weighing in at 1 question so far, so I really need you guys to step up with additional questions so we can keep this conversation going.
Shawn, one question I have is whether it's Primo or another product, what kind of recommendations would you have for a rate? Or is it even possible to spray like the edges of our warning tracks and our infield skinned areas to cut down on our edging requirements?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. and I am, when it comes to primo rates for higher heights of cut, I am not as familiar. Most of my research has been done on greens. You know, we're looking at, on putting green situations, we're looking at 0.125 fluid ounces per thousand. And so when you move to a fairway height of cut, so an athletic field height of cut, your routine frequent out program would be a 1/4 ounce per thousand. But when it comes to what the recommendation is for, you know, max use rates, I couldn't even tell you what the max use rate is right now, which I am frantically trying to look up, which on a screen that is currently shared with you guys, the label for that. Let's see, current EPA approved label. Let's see, well, let me just see if I can find the table real quick. Try to refresh my memory on this. We've done quite a bit of work on trying to improve, you know, from an athletic field standpoint, trying to improve overseed performance in dense Bermuda grass using high rates of primo. But I'm afraid we may have, let's see. Exceeded the label on some of that research. So here's the, this table right here is showing us the maximum application rates. And one thing that I can tell you, now, so I wasn't around when Primo was developed. Well, I was around, but I wasn't in turf. And so I attended a presentation by Fred Yelverton, and he talked about, you know, the early days, whenever an experimental coated product comes to us as university researchers, at that point, we're looking at all scenarios. You know, we're looking at all rates. We're trying to figure out what the product will do. And so Fred claims that you have to get, so you guys see the rates here in fluid ounce per acre, right? 33. Here's 44. Yeah, 44 is the highest recommended rate per in fluid ounces per acre. Fred said that you have to get north of 2 gallons. Okay, so that would be 256 fluid ounces before you start actually killing grass. So there's a large latitude with using Primo in terms of managing turf response. All right. One other word of caution though is power in Primo. Like you can, if you put enough product on, you can kind of go outside of the, I'm going to send a hormonal signal to tell the turf not to elongate a leaf, into a realm where I'm going to cause secondary effects and injure this plant. So if you dump enough on to get to that point, then you can get a higher level of growth regulation. You can actually get, you know, approaching growth cessation. But it's very costly. And if you were staying in that area of growth regulation, adding additional rate is not going to achieve additional regulation. It's just going to cost you more money. So it would be in frequency of application is where we get a better extension of long-term regulation at that maximum level, which the research suggests is at or near 50% reduction in clippings. And so with a product like Primo, you're not going to get the type of long-term suppression that you will with a low rate herbicide, because we're not talking about stopping the plant from growing. We're talking about reducing how extended each of the cells will be, and therefore reducing the height of each leaf. But those leaves are still actively being produced. And so money should be, and I mean, right now this may not apply as well, but what you would do is, well, if you're looking for, if your end goal is to reduce the amount of time that a laborer is on site, then the only way to achieve that with a product like Primo is to up the rate. And it can get costly. And I would think that in order to do that, your rates are going to be well north of what this legal document suggests. We would be looking at, in tall fescue, probably in the area of 60 plus ounces per acre in order to really shut that turf down. And you'll get a mild discoloration that's going to be similar to what you would see with the ornament.
Now, on the topic of Primo, how does the pH of the tank mix factor into the efficacy of a PGR application? Like, for example, Primo, if you look at the SDS, it's typically the pH is around a 3. How important is it to buffer that tank before you apply it when you think about the cost of these PGR applications?
That's a good question. And it speaks to a broader topic that let's just go ahead and hit on. So most pesticide products in general, and obviously Trinexpac ethyl is another example. Most of these things are weak acids, all right? And so, and with a pH of 3, that's tack on, for Primo. And so we have products on the market designed to buffer spray tanks to achieve a more acidic environment for that product, because a weak acid is going to be most like itself in its native form in an acidic pH. So if you were using Roundup, for example, and you bought a tank compatibility agent for that, one of the first things that, and it's also in the formulation of Roundup to try to achieve this as well, one of the first things that's going to happen is your spray pH is going to go down. How much does that help? It varies with product, but for those that are, and honestly, I do not know about Primo, with Primo, you're getting about 75% of the product absorbed through the foliage, 25% through the roots. So that root component is going to be, it's going to be what it's going to be. You're not going to put something in the spray tank to improve that. It's going to be based on soil pH conditions. But that foliar component, in most cases, and I can't say specifically for Primo, but in most cases, when the spray pH is approaching something more desirable for the molecule, such as with a weak acid, the spray pH being acidic, you're going to get better absorption of that molecule into the plant. One reason, if you think about this, is for those, and most of them are, for those molecules that are going to diffuse across the membrane passively, meaning they're just flowing along a concentration gradient. The surfactants are helping them penetrate the wax on the leaf surface. But after that, in order to move across that living membrane, they just diffuse in on a concentration gradient. Just like if you put a dry paper towel next to a puddle of water, as soon as it touches, the water just starts wicking across that paper towel because the concentration of water in the paper towel is way, way lower than in that puddle. Well, when these pesticides exist outside of their desired pH range, let's say, for example, you had a pH 7 municipal water supply and you had a weak acid product like Primo, well, the molecules are going to whatever ions they have associated with those molecules, they're going to dissociate. So you can get different forms or species, we call them, of the molecule in the tank. So you may have 3 or 4 different forms of the glyphosate molecule because it's attached to a calcium ion or it's attached to something else. Well, that means each one of those acts as its own entity from the standpoint of a concentration gradient. So if you had a weak acid spray solution, all of your glyphosate would be the isopropylamine salt, which was what it was supposed to be coming out of the jug. And therefore, the concentration of isopropylamine salt outside the membrane is very high, and therefore you're pumping more rapidly into the plant along that concentration gradient. But if you had 5 different species of glyphosate, the concentration of each is going to be lower. So it's really, if you have these like 10% molecular species out there hanging out, they don't even have enough concentration necessarily to even move across the membrane. And so if you had 3 of those going on, you just effectively kind of reduced your rate by 30%. And so having a spray tank mixture that is of a compatible pH is very important. You also have scenarios, and I'm not aware of, you know, when it, I think it would require talking to maybe somebody from Bayer, but in my experience, I have not run across complaints or issues associated with spray solution condition affecting PGR performance. But at the same time, we have all kind of boogeymen in the world of PGR performance. And we have a lot of reasons why they've been accused of not performing here or there. And who knows, you know, it definitely could be spray tank related. But with glyphosate, there's been quite a bit of research done to show just how sensitive that herbicide can be. And surely I know the ALS inhibitors are similar in this respect. And then there's some products out there that aren't really sensitive to spray tank solution, like the hormone herbicides, 2,4-D, dicamba, et cetera. They're not as dependent on, even though they're weak acid herbicides, they're not very dependent on spray tank solution and their absorption and their overall performance. But back to glyphosate. So not only do you have this concentration gradient issue, you have the situation of with some molecules, and glyphosate's a good example, it has a lot of different charge sites on the molecule. And when the isopropylamine salt dissociates into glyphosate acid and the different ions because of a higher spray tank pH, if you also have hard water, any of the magnesium or calcium that's in that spray tank will bind to the glyphosate acid. And when this happens with glyphosate, it essentially renders the molecule inactive for as long as those ions are bound to it. So using a tank conditioner like UAN or AMS, ammonium sulfate for glyphosate, that's going to go around. So we normally talk about, I keep backing up, but we normally talk about mixing of spray tanks in a particular order. And we always mix, if you're putting several things in the tank, we always mix from the driest dry to the wettest wet from a mixing compatibility standpoint. So, and we always put adjuvants last, all right? Well, there's an exception there when it comes to AMS. You would always put AMS in the tank first before adding a product like glyphosate. And when I say, just backing up again, when I say driest dry to wettest wet, what I'm talking about is a coarse granular dry dispersible product would go in first because that's going to be the hardest thing to dissolve. And by design, the formulators have set that product up to dissolve in pure water, not water that's already got 2 other pesticides mixed in with it, okay? So changing the properties of the water by mixing those other products may prevent that dry granule, that the dispersible granule from dissolving. You would go dispersible granule, then to another dry product that's more finely ground, like a wettable powder, then to a really thick liquid, something like tenacity, just thick, soupy, that would go in next, and then a thin liquid would go in last. So that's what I mean by driest dry to wettest wet. We mix in order of difficulty to get things dispersed in water, with more difficult being first, least difficult being last. Because the concern is if we change our spray tank properties, then if it's already difficult to start with, you don't want to make it more difficult to get that product in suspension. All right, and then adjuvants go last, except AMS. All right, so why does AMS go in first? The reason is, I mentioned with glyphosate, you need to lower the spray tank pH so that the molecule does not dissociate. You want all of that glyphosate to be glyphosate isopropylamine salt, and you want it to remain the isopropylamine salt. So at a pH of 4, that's what it's going to do. All right, but let's just say that you may have some dissociation. Well, the next step is you don't want any magnesium or calcium floating around to be able to lock on to your glyphosate acid. That's what AMS does. It's a cleaner, essentially. AMS, when you put it in the tank, it's going to go around and bind to all free-floating magnesium and calcium and lock them out. So it'll bind to them first so that when you put the glyphosate in, even if you do have free-floating glyphosate acid, there's no calcium or magnesium left to bind to. And that's why AMS is going to improve glyphosate performance. Some of the research has shown that glyphosate performance can double by having the spray tank properly conditioned. So you can
now, on the subject of glyphosate, if someone were to use a low level of glyphosate as a PGR, are they going to see any kind of weed control with that lowered rate being used for growth regulation?
Not enough to count on. You can see, for example, young seedling grasses are going to be the most susceptible. So crabgrass, goosegrass, if they're just germinating and they're young and they're out there, yes, it'll take them out. If they have any maturity to them, no, it will not. One of the other things that I will warn you that you will see is for hardened perennial grasses, particularly nasty ones that you don't like, many of them are more tolerant of glyphosate than the tall fescue is. And one notable example is nimblewill. And so repeated use of a glyphosate as a PGR type approach is going to favor nimblewill. But we can take nimblewill out with something like tenacity. But that's another, you'll see certain, if you've got a hodgepodge out there, you're going to see a lot of species start to break before tall fescue would, which in some cases, if what you're trying to do is manage mowing, and if you got these little broadleaf seed heads coming out like buckhorn plantain and whatnot, you might be getting called on the carpet. I thought you said you was going to keep this mowed. So that could be an issue where the glyphosate program is going to perform less for you in a site that's full of nasty broadleaves and certain perennial grasses than it will on a pure stand of tall fescue.
And can you just touch again to recap, what is the recommended spray volume per acre you were given for lighter applications of those Class D herbicides?
So spray volume, we're still pretty flexible on that. Typically, systemic herbicides are going to perform actually, and many people don't know this because the turf industry, especially on the golf side, but I think industry-wide, we think of our spray applications in terms of our very expensive fungicides. And so there's like this trend in turf that if you're not at least 1 gallon per 1,000, then you're not putting out an appropriate turf grass application. And that's not true. In the world of herbicides, actually lower application volumes produce better effects from truly systemic herbicides, which most of our herbicides are truly systemic, where most fungicides are just acropical penetrants. They're not true systemic products. And so you have to really drench the turf to get those products down to the growing point, whereas that's not necessary for herbicides. And we often see, think of it this way, Roundup, I keep going back to glyphosate because it's the most studied herbicide in the world, and there's a lot of really good examples to be drawn. So if I'm talking about glyphosate, it's not because I'm recommending that the only thing that there is for you to use is glyphosate. It's just that they're good examples to indicate what other less research products probably are doing. But anyway, think of it like this. You need a concentration gradient to get a passively diffused herbicide across the membrane, as I said earlier. Which is going to be better? 100 droplets that each have 1,000 molecules of glyphosate, or 1,000 droplets that each have 100 molecules of glyphosate? So it's going to be better to have 1,000 molecules of glyphosate in the same small area, a point of contact on a spherical droplet. It'll be better to have 10 times the concentration than it would be 10 times the number of droplets in different places. So each droplet is pumping a lot less. You have more droplets, you're getting better coverage, but we're looking at a systemic herbicide. We want to pump material into the plant and have it move around and do what it needs to do, versus a contact herbicide that usually is going to affect tissue locally, only where it falls. Well, in that scenario, yes, we would want to up the application volume. So with low rate PGR products, I would say that your minimum GPA needs to be 15 gallons per acre. Your maximum needs to be 60. So we're I think a really good place to be is at about, just because of compatibility with your other spray volumes. You don't just take a ride-on sprayer and snap your fingers and swing from 1 to 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet all the way down to 1/4 of a gallon to a 1/2 gallon, because the pump doesn't have that type of range flexibility to give you that range of pressure. So you're either changing out nozzles, so you don't want to get into that. So typically right at 1 gallon per 1,000 is going to put you in range for both fungicides, even ones that need higher than 1 gallon per 1,000. You should be in range pressure-wise to compensate that. You can go down to say 3/4 gallon, but certainly, your actual range can be anywhere from less than 1/2 gallon per 1,000 to 1.5. We're pretty flexible there.
All right. What do you recommend for easing into a PGR program on tips to avoid the initial discoloration, whether it's through adding iron or a fertilizer into the mix? How to offset that discoloration for someone that may be starting out on a PGR program?
Right. Well, definitely cutting the rate on the initial application and using chelated iron would be the absolute Cadillac best, most aggressive approach that you could throw out there. And so, I still have the Primo table up over here. So you're looking at, 0.75 ounce per 1,000 would be a pretty aggressive rate for a higher height of cut tall fescue, for example. But you can cut that rate in half and use chelated iron on the initial application, and then come out a couple of weeks later with a follow-up cut rate, and that should get your first 3 to 4 week interval taken care of, and after that you should be able to go full rate. Another thing that I'll throw out that I really didn't mention in terms of using plant growth regulators and setting the frequency of application. For the longest time, the label just said, hey, put out these rates and put it out monthly. And what turf managers were finding out is, this used to work, but it's like it's not working anymore. So we tightened up on our intervals. And next thing you know, pretty much everyone in the industry is going out at 1 to 2 week intervals instead of what the label said, 4 week. So a lot of research has been done in the past 8 years or so to indicate, and this is pretty unique to Primo. So for Primo, unlike several of the other plant growth regulators, the metabolism, in other words, the breakdown of that molecule by the plant, inside the plant, is temperature dependent. And as temperatures get hotter, the plant chews up the Primo faster. And so what they came up with is a growing degree day based trigger for repeat application of Primo. So instead of saying, go out on a 2-week interval or go out on a 4-week interval, it's 200 growing degree days. And that the number of growing degree days, and this is when I say 200 growing degree days, I mean 200 growing degree days at a base temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So in hot summer, it doesn't take long to, you can be accumulating 30 to 40 growing degree days per day in a really, really hot summer situation with a base of just 32, the freezing temperature. But what that usually ends up happening is somewhere between 7 to 10 day intervals are optimal during summer, and 2 to 4 week intervals are optimal during this time of year and into the fall. And so in terms of getting the best suppression pattern with Primo, that's how we now do it. And the number of growing degree days varies with the turf species that you're targeting. I would look at Krauser's work. You can look him up on the internet, Bill Krauser from, help me out, Goatley or McCall. He's at
Nebraska.
Yeah, Nebraska.
University of Nebraska.
Yeah.
And I was going to say as well, too, a good tool for everyone to have in their toolbox when you talk about growing degree days and Primo applications. I know a lot of people have moved to using the app called Greenkeeper that can help you with planning out your PGR applications, looking at the growing degree days and taking that into account.
Now with products like Trim It, we actually do the opposite. As temperatures get hotter and hotter, turf response tends to increase in step, and we tend to lower rates to manage phyto. So don't fall in the situation of applying that as it gets hotter, I need more frequent rule to all the plant growth regulators.
How will fertilizer needs and requirements change if someone moves into a PGR program such as Primo?
Good question. It depends on how aggressive the PGR program is. Now you said such as Primo. So with a scenario with Primo, in most cases, fertilizer needs really don't change. The plant is still growing. It's still producing shoots. It's still producing leaves. They're just not as long, and not as many of them are being mown off. And so carbohydrate reserves that are being generated and not lost to leaf cutting are dispersed in different places, like higher shoot density and possibly deeper roots. If you're getting really aggressive with super high rates of a product like Primo, and you're actually getting slight injury to the plant and thus reducing its actual growth, then fertilizer would be reduced in step with that. Likewise, if you're shutting it down with a Class D PGR like glyphosate or metsulfuron or fluazepop, then in that case, you really don't need fertilizer during the inhibited period. But again, that's a situation where, you're taking an aesthetic hit and you're planning to basically put that turf on a shelf for 6 to 8 weeks, and I'll come back and start managing it again later. Okay. It's basically putting it in suspended animation. And I can't say this enough. I want everybody to listen. You can only do that once per season. At least in my experience, when we have come back with follow-up applications, every time we've caused severe thinning and loss of turf. Not so severe that I guess, you can get that turf back the following fall, but you're going to see a totally different response with a follow-up application than what you get with the first application of the season. And it's going to be more severe and more loss of turf.
Now, you kind of mentioned glyphosate's a one-time application with a product like Primo or some of the other PGRs. If you got on that program, when is the time that you come off of that program? When would your last application for the season be?
That's a good question too. So typically the last application is going to be when the growing season ends. So as Mother Nature starts to take over the regulation of turf growth, you stop applying. And during that period for Primo, it just so happens that our frequency of application goes to, 4 weeks plus anyway. At really low temperatures where it's taking us 4 to 5 weeks to accumulate 200 base 32 growing degree days, we're not applying very frequently anyway. And so to put a time to it, for a warm season turf scenario, you would be discontinuing your PGR program sometime in October, late September to October. For a cool season turf, you're probably going to be sometime in November, late November.
All right. And then last question is, will using PGRs, how will that affect the water requirements of our turf and our irrigation needs, or sustaining a drought period if we were to get that?
Well, again, the Class Ds, like the herbicides, are going to really help you in that respect, in that the plant is it's quasi-dormant, all right? But at the same time, it's hurt and it's struggling. Lack of water would be another stress, but if I had to bet, I would say that since your plants are already shut down, they're going to be able to actually come through that water stress situation better than actively growing plants. Likewise, if there's been examples in the industry, I haven't done research on this, but where people are using things like Roundup to maintain dormancy of Bermuda grass turf in areas where you get sporadic warming periods in the winter or late winter. You can shut it back down with Roundup, and coming through the end of winter and the first of spring, you keep your Bermuda grass dormant so you don't get a late spring hard freeze that kills Bermuda grass. And that's been shown to work. So there is some evidence that herbicide-based PGR shutdown can safen turf to a stressful environment. I can't say for sure on water stress, but my guess would be that you would have less need for water if you're regulated. Now, with Primo regulation, if that regulation is just elongation that's being reduced, therefore just clipping reduction, then the same would not apply. It probably is going to respond similar to non-regulated turf. There is plenty of research that physiologists like Dr. Urban have done to show that Primo helps one come through drought stress, shade stress, etc. But I don't think Primo is going to have that big of an impact on water requirement of the turf. But there will be it's an improvement for sure. So less water would be required.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for today. I'd like to take a minute just to thank you for taking some time out of your day to speak with us this morning, and we appreciate it very much.
Yeah, happy to do it. And if anybody has additional questions, by all means, just email me, and I will get to those in time.
All right. Well,
Could you provide your email to everybody?
What's that?
Could you provide your email?
Oh yeah. Well, you can look me up at tech. It's but my email is Askew, SASKEW @vt.edu.